Welcome to Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode, we're diving into a theory that strikes at the very core of our digital lives. Are big tech companies silencing the truth? From deplatforming whistleblowers to algorithmic suppression of dissenting views, many believe that the flow of information is no longer free, but tightly controlled by a handful of powerful corporations. Stay with us as we investigate the growing fear behind what some are calling the Great Censorship. The roots of what many now call the Great Censorship reach back decades, long before social media, smartphones, or even the modern internet. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to examine the evolution of information control across the 20th and early 21st centuries, when new forms of media began to challenge traditional power structures. The tension between freedom of expression and centralized control has always existed, but the stakes grew exponentially with the birth of the digital age. In the early 20th century, the control of public opinion was relatively straightforward. A small number of newspapers, radio networks, and later television broadcasters dominated the media landscape. Information flowed from the top down. Governments and corporate interests learned to leverage this limited distribution network to shape public perception, sometimes through outright propaganda, other times through more subtle methods of influence. This era laid the foundation for what theorists would later describe as the information gatekeepers, entities with the power to decide what the public could or couldn't see. With the rise of the internet in the 1990s, everything appeared to change. The web was heralded as a new frontier, an open and democratic space where anyone could share ideas without censorship. Activists, journalists, whistleblowers, and ordinary citizens embraced this freedom, believing that the age of centralized control was coming to an end. Early adopters of the internet saw it as a revolutionary tool for transparency and decentralization. And for a while, that vision seemed to be coming true. But as the internet matured, so too did the forces seeking to control it. Major tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and others, emerged as the new arbiters of information. They didn't just build the platforms people used, they began to determine what people saw on those platforms. Algorithms replaced human editors, but the effect was the same: a curated flow of content, optimized for engagement, monetization, and increasingly ideological conformity. The political environment also shifted. Following the 9/11 attacks, the US and other governments adopted sweeping surveillance and cybersecurity policies. The Patriot Act, for instance, gave authorities unprecedented access to digital communications. The public was told this was a necessary trade-off for safety. Yet for some, it marked the beginning of a more insidious control of online discourse. Suddenly, privacy felt optional, and speech that fell outside certain norms or narratives was quietly nudged to the margins. By the 2010s, concerns over fake news, election interference, and online radicalization created a perfect storm. Tech companies, facing government scrutiny and public pressure, began tightening their moderation policies. Terms like misinformation, disinformation, and harmful content entered the mainstream. Content flagged as problematic was demoted, hidden, or deleted. Accounts were suspended or banned, and crucially, the definitions of what constituted misinformation seemed to shift depending on the political climate. These actions weren't always coordinated, but the result was a narrowing of acceptable discourse. Whether it was an independent journalist covering controversial topics, a whistleblower challenging the official narrative, or a citizen raising uncomfortable questions, their voices often found themselves suppressed, shadowbanned, or drowned out by algorithmic manipulation. This historical backdrop sets the stage for the conspiracy, that a concerted effort, either through collusion or shared interest, is now underway to silence dissent and enforce a unified worldview, dictated not by governments alone, but by the tech corporations that have become more powerful than nations themselves. As the idea of the Great Censorship gained traction, the conspiracy began to crystallize around a cast of influential figures and powerful organizations. These weren't just shadowy individuals in smoke-filled rooms. They were CEOs of trillion-dollar companies, government officials, and tech policy architects operating in plain sight, wielding influence not through brute force, but through algorithms, policies, and digital frameworks that shape the modern information ecosystem. At the heart of this narrative sits Mark Zuckerberg, co-founder and CEO of Meta Platforms. Once viewed as a college dropout success story who connected the world, Zuckerberg's name became increasingly associated with Facebook's ability to moderate or manipulate public discourse. Following the 2016 US presidential election, Facebook faced intense scrutiny over its role in spreading so-called misinformation. In response, the platform ramped up its content moderation efforts, partnering with third-party fact-checkers and tweaking its algorithms. Critics argue that these measures often disproportionately targeted voices that questioned mainstream narratives, especially on politically charged topics like elections, pandemics, and government policy. Then there's Sundar Pichai, CEO of Alphabet Inc., Google's parent company. Google controls over 90% of the world's search engine traffic, and with YouTube under its wing, it has unprecedented power over what billions of people see, hear, and believe. Leaked internal memos, such as the infamous Good Censor document, suggest that Google's role has shifted from being an impartial platform to what some employees described as a responsible gatekeeper. This shift has led to accusations that Google quietly reconfigures search results to suppress controversial content, demonetizes channels that challenge dominant narratives, and boosts authoritative sources, often favoring legacy media outlets aligned with government or corporate interests. Twitter, before Elon Musk's acquisition, also played a central role in this theory. Under former CEO Jack Dorsey, Twitter became notorious for high-profile account bans and suspensions, actions that critics described as ideologically motivated. The suspension of a sitting US president's account in 2021 was seen by many as the clearest signal yet that big tech was no longer just a communications tool. It had become a political actor. Internal documents released as part of the Twitter files exposed correspondence between Twitter executives and government agencies discussing content removal, further stoking concerns about state-private collusion in digital censorship. Even lesser-known figures emerge as key players. Nina Jankowicz, briefly tapped to lead the US government's short-lived Disinformation Governance Board, became a lightning rod for debate. Her background in combating online disinformation raised eyebrows among free speech advocates who feared the formation of a government body focused on policing thought and expression. The rapid collapse of the board after public backlash only fueled speculation that more covert censorship efforts were already underway. Beyond individuals, entire organizations come into focus. The World Economic Forum, often at the center of global conspiracy theories, is said to play a guiding role in pushing for centralized control over digital speech. Critics point to WEF panels where tech executives and politicians openly discuss misinformation mitigation strategies. Some interpret these discussions not as protective measures, but as blueprints for suppressing dissent on a global scale. These are the figures and entities conspiracy theorists claim are orchestrating, or at least enabling, a coordinated effort to define truth and silence opposition. Whether acting in concert or following converging incentives, the perception remains. Control over what we see, think, and say now lies in the hands of a select few, and the consequences of that control are only just beginning to be understood. Proponents of the Great Censorship theory point to a range of claims and examples that they argue serve as clear evidence that big tech companies are deliberately manipulating the public narrative. These aren't isolated complaints about removed posts or account bans. They form what believers see as a pattern. Coordinated suppression of dissenting voices, enforced through algorithms, moderation tools, and behind-the-scenes influence from powerful interests. One of the most cited examples is the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story in October 2020. When the New York Post published a report detailing the contents of a laptop allegedly belonging to the president's son, the story was immediately restricted on Twitter and downranked on Facebook. Users couldn't share the article, and accounts posting about it were temporarily locked. At the time, both platforms justified the suppression by claiming the story violated hacked materials policies or required further verification. But critics saw this as politically motivated censorship, aimed at influencing the outcome of the US presidential election. The fact that the story was later confirmed as authentic by multiple outlets only fueled suspicions that big tech had acted in coordination with political operatives to bury inconvenient truths. Another focal point is the way platforms handled information related to COVID-19. From the earliest days of the pandemic, content questioning the official narrative was flagged, suppressed, or removed entirely. Videos suggesting that the virus may have originated from a lab in Wuhan were demonetized or banned. Posts advocating alternative treatments or questioning mask mandates and lockdowns were labeled as dangerous misinformation. Even prominent medical professionals and scientists found their content restricted if it strayed from World Health Organization guidance. Yet many of these disputed claims, including the lab leak theory, later gained mainstream credibility. For conspiracy theorists, this is taken as further proof that big tech serves not the public interest, but the agendas of select global institutions. Censorship is also alleged in matters of war and international conflict. During Russia's invasion of Ukraine, multiple platforms began aggressively moderating content that contradicted the official Western narrative. Accounts critical of NATO, the Ukrainian government, or US involvement in the conflict were suspended or had their reach limited. Some channels were demonetized, while others vanished entirely. Though defenders of the platform say these actions were necessary to prevent the spread of harmful propaganda, critics argue that they set a dangerous precedent, where dissent, even when grounded in legitimate geopolitical analysis, is erased in favor of a singular, state-approved story. Whistleblowers and former employees have also added fuel to the theory. Frances Haugen, a former Facebook employee, leaked documents in 2021 suggesting the platform had internal knowledge about its ability to influence public emotion and suppress certain types of content. Though she herself advocated for tighter regulation, theorists used her revelations to argue that such control had already gone too far, and that it was being wielded with bias. Add to this the emergence of fact-checkers, often affiliated with media organizations or funded by politically connected foundations. These entities gained the power to label content as false or misleading, triggering algorithmic suppression across multiple platforms. The process, critics argue, lacks transparency and accountability. The question becomes, who checks the fact-checkers? The sum of these claims paints a picture of an information landscape where controversial truths are not debated but deleted, and where public opinion is nudged, not formed. For those who believe in the great censorship, this isn't just about tech companies enforcing community standards. It's about a fundamental reshaping of reality itself, controlled from behind the curtain. Scrutinizing the evidence behind the great censorship theory demands a closer look at how platforms actually function, particularly how moderation policies are implemented, how algorithms make decisions, and who influences the rules. Supporters of the theory argue that when viewed together, these elements form a system that doesn't merely enforce guidelines, but subtly and systemically erases dissenting perspectives. The algorithms at the heart of platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are designed to prioritize content based on engagement. This seemingly neutral goal becomes more complex when paired with content moderation rules that penalize so-called misinformation or hate speech. Once a piece of content is flagged, either by users, moderators, or automated systems, it can be downranked, demonetized, or removed entirely. The user may never know why their reach suddenly vanished, and the process is often opaque. Take YouTube, for example. Numerous creators have reported that discussing certain topics, like vaccine safety, election integrity, or controversial historical events, leads to videos being demonetized or buried in search results. In many cases, the platform never provides a clear explanation. Appeals are processed by algorithms or faceless moderators, leaving users in the dark. Critics argue this opacity is not a bug, but a feature, designed to chill speech and quietly enforce ideological boundaries without direct confrontation. Verification of the Hunter Biden laptop story presents another complex case. At the time of its suppression, intelligence officials signed a public letter stating the story had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. Platforms relied on this framing to justify censorship. However, the story's contents were later confirmed by mainstream outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, with no evidence of Russian involvement. This about-face raised serious questions. Were tech companies too quick to suppress, or were they acting on cues from political actors? Emails released under FOIA requests show some level of coordination between government agencies and tech firms in deciding what to moderate, though whether this constitutes a conspiracy or an overreach of public-private cooperation is still debated. Fact-checking is another pressure point. Many organizations relied upon by big tech platforms, such as PolitiFact, the Associated Press, or Lead Stories, have received funding from foundations with clear ideological leanings, including the Open Society Foundations and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. While this doesn't inherently prove bias, critics suggest it undermines the neutrality of the fact-checking process. When a post is labelled as false, even if it contains legitimate debate or nuance, that label can trigger shadow banning across multiple platforms, effectively silencing the content. Another key issue is the suppression of alternative voices in scientific and medical discourse. Throughout the pandemic, numerous experts, including virologists, epidemiologists, and public health officials, were deplatformed for challenging mainstream guidance. Dr. Robert Malone, one of the inventors of mRNA technology, saw his account suspended for expressing concerns about vaccine mandates. Supporters argue these experts were raising valid concerns. Critics say they were spreading dangerous misinformation. Regardless, the decision to silence them was not based on public votes or open debate, but on back-end decisions made by platform executives or their partners. What emerges from analysing this evidence is a pattern. Platforms routinely act in ways that align with specific political or institutional interests, often without transparency or recourse for the affected users. Whether this behaviour is the result of direct collusion or a convergence of shared agendas, the effect is nearly identical. The boundary of acceptable speech narrows, and those who stray too far from it risk being digitally erased. And as the lines between government, media and tech continue to blur, critics argue it's becoming harder to tell where policy ends and censorship begins. Despite the growing narrative surrounding the Great Censorship, many experts and media analysts push back, offering a range of counter-arguments that aim to debunk or at least contextualize the theory. They argue that what conspiracy theorists call censorship is in many cases simply moderation, an essential function of digital platforms tasked with managing billions of pieces of content in real time. From this perspective, content removal and account suspensions are not signs of a coordinated conspiracy, but necessary actions to combat real-world harms like misinformation, hate speech, and incitement. First, skeptics point to the unprecedented scale of digital content as a major factor. Platforms like YouTube and Facebook handle millions of uploads and posts daily. Even with sophisticated algorithms and thousands of moderators, mistakes are inevitable. False positives, where legitimate content is mistakenly flagged or removed, happen regularly, they admit, but are not necessarily evidence of systemic suppression. To these analysts, errors in moderation do not prove intent or collusion, just logistical challenges in managing information at scale. Moreover, critics of the conspiracy emphasize that platforms are private companies. As such, they are not bound by the First Amendment, which restricts government, not private censorship. In this view, Facebook or Twitter removing content from their platforms is akin to a private business choosing not to carry certain products. Users agree to terms of service when they sign up, and violations of those terms, including sharing what the platforms deem misinformation, can result in consequences. While some may see this as overreach, others argue it's a company exercising its right to enforce its own standards. Another argument hinges on the motivations behind content moderation. Skeptics of the conspiracy claim that platforms are not primarily driven by ideology but by liability and profit. The 2016 and 2020 elections, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, exposed how misinformation could spread quickly online, sometimes with real-world consequences. Under pressure from lawmakers, advertisers and advocacy groups, platforms implemented stricter moderation policies not to silence truth, but to avoid backlash, legal risk, or loss of public trust. In this reading, Big Tech isn't acting as a political enforcer. It's protecting its brand and bottom line. Then there's the question of government involvement. While internal emails and public hearings have shown some level of communication between tech companies and government agencies, defenders say this coordination is often limited to national security threats, foreign disinformation campaigns, or public health emergencies. The goal, they argue, isn't to suppress political opinions, but to safeguard against real-world harm. For example, when the Department of Homeland Security flagged potential Russian bots during elections, or when the CDC provided guidance to platforms during the early stages of COVID, it was seen as a public duty, not a conspiracy. Fact-checkers, too, have defended their role. Organizations like Snopes, factcheck.org, and others often publish their methodologies and funding sources, arguing that transparency is key to building trust. While some may question their political neutrality, these groups insist they operate independently of governments or corporations and are committed to correcting false claims, regardless of their political implications. Finally, critics argue that labeling the current information landscape as a censorship regime ignores a broader truth. Never in history have so many people had such broad access to share and receive information. Podcasts, independent blogs, social media platforms, and even alternative search engines offer dissenting voices ample room to operate. If anything, skeptics say the abundance of opinions online has made it harder, not easier, for any centralized group to control the narrative. In sum, while the great censorship theory points to real concerns about transparency and overreach, critics argue that calling it a coordinated conspiracy overstates the evidence. They suggest the real issue may not be a deliberate silencing of truth, but a messy, evolving struggle to manage the flow of information in an increasingly chaotic digital world. Stepping back from the debate over evidence and counter-arguments, it's worth examining the broader implications of the great censorship theory, not just on free speech or tech policy, but on the collective psyche of society itself. Whether the theory is true, partially true, or entirely exaggerated, its existence has already had a profound cultural and psychological impact, reshaping how people relate to information, authority, and each other. One of the most significant consequences is the erosion of public trust. In an age saturated with conflicting narratives, many no longer believe that mainstream media or tech companies are neutral gatekeepers. Even those who don't fully subscribe to the conspiracy often express skepticism about how content is prioritized or suppressed online. This shift in trust isn't confined to fringe groups. It has seeped into mainstream political discourse, fueling growing cynicism toward institutions that once claimed to speak for the public interest. This loss of trust has catalyzed a parallel rise in alternative media ecosystems. As audiences grow wary of curated feeds and algorithmically sanitized content, they've turned to independent platforms, Substack newsletters, and encrypted messaging apps like Telegram or Signal. These digital spaces promise unfiltered speech and greater autonomy, but they also function as echo chambers. Inside them, narratives of censorship and control are amplified, often without challenge. The result is a kind of digital tribalism, where each group trusts only its own sources and treats all others with suspicion or hostility. Culturally, the great censorship theory taps into a deeper tension between individual autonomy and collective control. The internet was once seen as the great equalizer, a place where any voice could be heard, any idea explored. But as that ideal has given way to algorithmic moderation and corporate oversight, many feel a sense of betrayal. The platforms that once symbolized freedom now appear to some as instruments of conformity. This feeling resonates across ideological lines, from libertarians decrying centralized control, to progressives questioning corporate monopolies, to populists challenging elite narratives. Politically, the implications are no less profound. Claims of censorship have become powerful rhetorical tools in modern campaigns. Politicians on both the left and right now routinely accuse tech companies of bias, influencing public opinion and shaping legislation. In the US, the debate has sparked congressional hearings, antitrust investigations, and executive orders aimed at curbing big tech's power. In other countries, especially authoritarian regimes, the censorship debate is weaponized to justify their own draconian restrictions on information, ironically, under the guise of protecting free speech. Psychologically, constant exposure to theories of manipulation and control can foster what researchers call epistemic anxiety, a deep uncertainty about what can be trusted as true. When people feel that information is filtered or distorted, they often respond by rejecting all authority altogether, even when that authority is grounded in evidence or expertise. This creates fertile ground for disinformation, making it easier for bad actors to exploit the vacuum left by a broken consensus on truth. Meanwhile, platforms themselves face a paradox. The more they moderate, the more they are accused of censorship. The less they moderate, the more they are blamed for enabling harmful content. Trapped between political pressure and user outrage, companies struggle to navigate the boundaries of free expression in a digital world that was never designed for moral arbitration. Ultimately, the great censorship theory has become more than a claim, it's a symbol of deeper discontent. It reflects a society grappling with questions that have no easy answers. Who gets to decide what we see? What is truth in the age of algorithms? And when the gatekeepers of knowledge begin to shape reality itself, how can anyone truly be free? Whether or not the conspiracy holds water, these are the questions now driving public discourse, and their answers will define the next chapter of the digital age. The societal and media landscape shaped by the great censorship theory is not only a battleground of ideas, but a reflection of evolving power dynamics in the information age. Its influence has stretched far beyond online forums or conspiracy circles, infiltrating mainstream newsrooms, entertainment, and even education. The idea that truth can be curated and possibly manipulated has left a deep imprint on how people interpret everything they consume, and in many ways has created a feedback loop between public suspicion and media response. Mainstream media outlets have had to adapt in real time. Initially dismissive of censorship claims, many legacy institutions such as CNN, the New York Times, and The Guardian have increasingly addressed the issue, though often with a defensive tone. In doing so, they've acknowledged the role big tech plays in shaping discourse, but frequently downplay the idea of coordination or political motive. This response hasn't mollified critics. Instead, it has heightened suspicion among those who believe the media is complicit in controlling the narrative. For some, the mere act of dismissing a conspiracy theory without full transparency only confirms that something is being hidden. Entertainment media has also become an unexpected player in this story. Shows like The Social Dilemma, documentaries on digital influence, and dramatized series about surveillance and manipulation have fueled public curiosity about how information is filtered online. These portrayals often blur the line between fiction and reality, leaving viewers with a sense that they've glimpsed behind the curtain, even if the details remain vague. In this space, the conspiracy isn't presented as a wild theory, it's framed as a cautionary truth. The result is a shift in public consciousness. A growing awareness that not everything we read, see, or share is organic, and that manipulation might be the rule, not the exception. This skepticism has extended to news consumption habits. Studies show that trust in media is at historic lows across multiple countries. In the US, for example, polls from Pew and Gallup indicate that many Americans now get their news from independent YouTubers, Substack writers, or niche podcasts, content creators who often claim to be outside the influence of big tech or traditional media. These creators are celebrated not just for their content, but for their perceived independence. The belief is that they haven't been bought, haven't been silenced, and therefore can be trusted more than institutions that once dominated public knowledge. As these independent voices gain traction, however, they're also being drawn into the same systems they critique. Algorithms determine their reach, monetization policies shape their language, and sudden changes in platform rules can erase their digital presence overnight. This irony reinforces the great censorship narrative. Even those who try to speak outside the system must operate within it, and are ultimately vulnerable to the same forces they oppose. This dynamic has also reshaped how people interpret digital silence. If a post is deleted or a creator disappears, some assume censorship by default, often before facts are available. In a world where deplatforming can be instantaneous and unexplained, absence becomes evidence. And whether or not that absence is due to policy enforcement, legal reasons, or even voluntary departure, the optics of silencing are enough to fuel further outrage and suspicion. Even institutions of education and academia have not been spared. Debates over what can be taught, which books can be assigned, and how controversial topics should be framed have all been coloured by the censorship discourse. Universities have faced criticism from both sides, accused by some of allowing too much radical content and by others of stifling dissenting viewpoints. The battleground extends to research funding, peer-reviewed publications, and public lectures, where the boundaries of acceptable knowledge are increasingly contested. Through media and societal narratives alike, the great censorship theory has moved from the margins to the mainstream. It no longer exists as a question asked by a few fringe voices. It is now a lens through which millions interpret the actions of governments, tech companies, and media organizations alike. Whether or not they agree with the theory, they live in a world shaped by its shadows. While the core of the great censorship theory revolves around tangible claims, like content moderation, algorithmic suppression, and political bias, there are deeper, more speculative layers that add a surreal dimension to the narrative. These fringe angles may not have mainstream acceptance, but they resonate powerfully in certain circles and serve to deepen the sense of mystery and paranoia surrounding the topic. They suggest that what we see online is not just filtered. It may be entirely fabricated or controlled by forces far beyond the average user's understanding. One such angle is the dead internet theory. This concept posits that much of the content we encounter online isn't created by humans at all, but by artificial intelligence. According to its proponents, human participation on the internet has steadily declined since the early 2010s, replaced by a flood of AI-generated content, social media posts, news articles, videos, even forum discussions. These bots aren't just spamming random messages, they're allegedly designed to reinforce certain narratives, suppress alternative thinking, and drown out dissent. If this were true, it would mean that the censorship people fear isn't just about deleting content, but about creating an artificial consensus through sheer volume. Another fringe theory contends that intelligence agencies are not merely advising big tech companies, they're embedded within them. Former NSA contractors, ex-CIA analysts, and even DARPA researchers are rumoured to hold influential roles in platform development teams. According to this view, platforms are not neutral tools co-opted by governments. They were designed from the beginning as instruments of social control. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, some argue, were never fully private ventures, but rather front-facing operations with back-channel connections to intelligence networks. While concrete evidence for this is lacking, revelations about programs like PRISM, where the NSA collected data from major tech firms, lend a shadowy plausibility to the idea. There are also those who tie the censorship narrative into broader metaphysical or esoteric frameworks. Some believe that information itself is a form of energy, and that controlling its flow allows elites to influence collective consciousness. In this model, censorship isn't just about hiding facts, it's about shaping the frequency of human thought, dulling awareness and weakening intuition. These beliefs often overlap with New Age or occult traditions, suggesting that digital censorship is part of a spiritual war for the human soul, with social media serving as the battleground. A more dystopian angle suggests that the censorship infrastructure we see today is merely the prototype for a future system of total control. This view anticipates the fusion of AI, biometrics, and social credit systems, a world where what you say online directly affects your access to services, travel, employment, or even food. In this future, dissent is not just deplatformed, it is punished in the physical world. While such systems are not fully in place in Western nations, references to China's social credit score and increased surveillance during emergencies are cited as proof that the infrastructure is quietly being built. Even time travel has made its way into the theory's fringe. Some claim that efforts to suppress specific information, especially about hidden technologies or ancient knowledge, are part of a larger effort to prevent future disruptions to the timeline. In this version, censorship isn't just about politics or profits. It's about preserving a carefully managed timeline where control remains in the hands of a few. These ideas, while speculative and often unverifiable, underscore a key element of conspiracy culture: the belief that the official narrative is not just wrong, it's designed to protect something profound. Though these angles may seem extreme, their spread underscores how the great censorship theory has become a kind of mythos, an evolving, multi-layered narrative that reflects deeper anxieties about reality, truth, and control. Whether based in fact, fantasy, or a little of both, these fringe interpretations ensure that the conversation doesn't just continue, it spirals into ever more complex and unsettling territory. The story of the great censorship is not one of easy answers. It's a web of allegations, coincidences, verifiable facts, speculative theories, and deeply felt suspicions. At its core lies a central question that transcends platforms, politics, and ideologies. Who decides what truth is in a digital age, where reality is filtered through the lens of algorithms, corporate interests, and state influence? We've seen how the historical precedent for information control laid the groundwork for the current debate. From the tightly controlled broadcasts of the mid-20th century to the seemingly open frontier of the early internet, the pendulum of speech has always swung between freedom and regulation. Yet what makes today different is the scale and invisibility of the mechanisms at work. Moderation is no longer a man with a red pen, its lines of code and unseen filters acting in microseconds, silently shaping what rises and what disappears. We examine the players, the tech giants, the government agencies, the fact-checking organizations, and the whistleblowers. Each plays a role in this evolving drama, sometimes transparently, often not. The evidence presented by believers in the great censorship is both compelling and troubling, from the suppression of key stories like the Hunter Biden laptop to the deplatforming of voices that strayed from mainstream narratives during the pandemic. Even if each action can be justified in isolation, the broader pattern raises legitimate concerns about the direction we're heading. But the other side is no less persuasive. Critics of the theory remind us that content moderation is complex, that private companies have the right to enforce their terms, and that the risks of misinformation are real and consequential. They caution against interpreting every deletion, every demonetization, as part of a sinister master plan. Sometimes, they argue, chaos is just chaos, and the attempt to find a pattern is human nature, not evidence of a conspiracy. Still, what cannot be denied is the atmosphere of distrust that now permeates our digital world. Trust in institutions, in media, and in the platforms we rely on daily has eroded. The result is a fragmented information ecosystem where everyone is suspicious of the other's facts, and where truth itself feels increasingly subjective. This is the true power and danger of the great censorship theory. Whether or not it's real in the way its strongest proponents believe, it has already reshaped public perception. People are asking harder questions, they are seeking alternatives, and they are no longer willing to take digital reality at face value. That shift alone marks a profound transformation in how society processes information. So where does that leave us? Perhaps the lesson is this: vigilance is essential, transparency is non-negotiable, and trust must be earned, not demanded. We may never know the full extent of what is or isn't being silenced. But in a world increasingly defined by invisible hands and hidden algorithms, the right to question, to doubt, is more vital than ever. Thanks for listening. This has been Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.